look at the high-stakes battle that is playing out in the United Kingdom as the country is voting as we speak to elect the next Prime Minister. And opinion polls are suggesting they are handing out rather a historic win to the Labour Party after the Tories have been in power for 14 long years. A public desire for change driven by internal strife within the Conservative Party has seen 5 ministers change in 8 years itself. Also contributing to their loss, to that projected loss, is the health crisis brewing, the immigration crisis, and most importantly, a cost of living crisis, which has made prices of basic commodities expensive for voters, and voters have been reeling under that pressure. But now, Prime Minister Rishi Sunak's surprise call to hold polls 6 months earlier than was required is all set to backfire. In fact, one of his closest aides was even spotted saying, "Vote to stop the Labour supermajority." It's as clear as could be possible. But what does a shift in UK politics mean from right-wing for the country? How are the markets really looking at this change in policy? And can the Labour Party handle issues related to migration responsibly and fix the economy and the cost of living crisis? Let's go to our guests to discuss that tonight. Joining us is Alastair Newton, the CEO of Alavan Business Advisory Limited, and Arnab Das, the Global Macro Strategist, EMEA Invesco. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for joining us this evening to discuss the UK polls. Let me come to you first, Mr. Newton. This election is being considered historic. I was just mentioning that Labour Party members have been calling it a supermajority. Why are voters so eager to vote in the Labour Party, given that the messaging from the Tories is that their taxes will rise if the Labour Party gets voted to power?
Well, I'm going to take issue with you on 3 points, if I may. First of all, I don't think this election is going to be historic. I think it's going to be an election which is largely going to be about continuity with added competence. And one of the reasons that voters are voting for Labour is because they're fed up with Conservative incompetence. That's the second issue. This election is largely about voting out the Conservatives, not voting in Labour. So continuity is going to be the key message. There will be change for sure. Labour has campaigned on the basis of change, but it will be incremental largely. Thirdly, I don't think there's any big surprises going on in this election. For sure, it may be historic in the sense of Labour will have a record majority in all likelihood, although the polls are not totally clear on that. But we're not actually moving from a far-right government. The Conservatives are right, for sure, but we're moving to a centrist government. And the biggest single change we've seen in British politics in the last 5 years is that Keir Starmer has made the Labour Party electable again. But the real challenges for Labour now, for Keir in particular, will actually start not today, but tomorrow on the 5th of July, when he is going to be confronted with, as you've already highlighted, some absolutely horrible issues, not least trying to fix the UK economy without raising taxes. Personally, I think he will probably break that election pledge, but I do think that the British electorate is actually steeled for that.
Right. Well said, Mr. Newton, on that. And that is really going to be the big challenge that's facing the Labour Party if the opinion polls indeed turn out to be true. Let me go to you, Mr. Das. Mr. Das, what is your assessment of how the markets are going to look at this? Give us a sense of the implications that the markets will have, considering that in India, it's been a different story altogether. We were, or rather the markets were voting, or they were bracing for continuity. But this time in the UK, it's a different story playing out. How are the markets going to see it? What is your view as far as a near-term performance of the markets is concerned?
Thanks for having me, and it's good to be on with Alastair as well. Look, I think I agree with a lot of what Alastair has said. I'll try to find some points where we can disagree later, maybe. But I think one implication of the various things that he has said is that this is largely priced in, right? Not an enormous amount is going to change in the short run. The UK's, problems, economic problems, policy challenges, they're deeply structural. And I don't think Labour is really going to be able to fix them in a big way, right? A big part of the story here that Labour is selling to the electorate, sort of consistent with that, what Alastair said about becoming electable again and being centrist, is about stability, right? We've had an enormous amount of turmoil here in the United Kingdom. Any number of prime ministers, an even larger number of chancellors, finance ministers, coming and going, lots of budgets, interim budgets, and main annual budgets that have made important, not massive, but important changes. We already have the highest tax burden as a share of GDP in the UK in 3 generations, right? So a lot of change, a lot of turmoil, a lot of disruption from Brexit, partly due to the pandemic, partly due to bad policy choices, as Alastair said. So stability is going to be a big part of the story in the short term. Now, stability is going to help. It's not really going to solve the productivity puzzle that this country faces and the stagnation that's resulted from that. So there's going to have to be some change over a longer period of time. But how we get to that change and what changes specifically are made will take time to see. It'll take time to see how they play out in the performance of the economy. My guess would be that they don't make that much difference, right? And so I don't think the markets are going to react in a big way. I don't think we're going to get the kind of big surprise that you sort of alluded to that we had in India. We had a surprise in Mexico. We had a surprise in South Africa. We had a surprise just earlier in the week in the French elections. And in the European parliamentary elections a few weeks before that for France, right? So we've had a lot of electoral surprises. Possibly we're going to have some important unexpected change in the US election. But I think the UK election, it's relatively predictable as to the big picture here, which is that power is going to switch from the right to the center left. Not much is going to change in the short term, some symbolic changes in taxes here and there. This idea of stability, I don't think it's going to make a huge amount of difference in the short term. I think we're going to need to see this play out over a period of years, if not a period of at least a couple of parliaments, before the UK can really rediscover its mojo.
Right. All right, Mr. Das, let me go to you, Mr. Newton, on that point and get in your reaction. Mr. Das is stating that the markets are already factoring in this change or continuity, as you were saying. But what is your view of how the markets are going to react over the next few months? And where do you see the country's economy move from here on, given the Labour Party's past track record?
I think we will see a basically business-friendly administration in the form of a Labour government. I happen to have known the Shadow Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, for many years since she was working for the Bank of England. She has a very good grasp of economics, and she has worked very hard, not only with the corporate sector, but also with the City of London, with markets, in order to reassure them about Labour's intentions. And like Arnab, I think basically that markets will be pleased to see a new government coming in, which is promised stability, it's promised change, but incrementally, as I said earlier, no big shocks. I think we will see a more radical side to a Labour government if the Labour government succeeds in winning a second term. But Sir Keir Starmer has taken many leaves out of the Tony Blair playbook, which is not to say that we're going to see a replay of the third way as such. I think Sir Keir is slightly more to the left than Tony Blair was. But keep in mind that Blair, rather like Margaret Thatcher, the other great changer, made most of their big changes in their second term. I think Sir Keir's principal objective is going to be to boost growth a little bit. Forecast of 1.8%. The market consensus at the moment is around 1.5%, I think. Maybe a little bit more than that, who knows? But his main objective is going to be to win that second term, when I think we would see a more radical Labour government than we're going to see in this first term. Very consistent with the way in which Sir Keir took over the Labour Party leadership after Labour got hammered by the Tories in 2019. And let's keep in mind there's an important lesson there too. The swing in this election relative to 2009 is going to be enormous. Tribalism in British electorate is dead. The swing will go back the other way if Labour do not get things right.
All right, that's a very interesting point indeed, and we'll have to see when the cabinet formation happens on the kind of leaders that are chosen and what kind of track records do they have in the past. But let me also stay with you, Mr. Newton, and get in your perspective on this overall rate scenario. In fact, the central bank kept the rates unchanged at 5.25%. It's a 16-year high. So when is the industry factoring in a cut? Is it going to happen at all this year? Because the bank says that inflation is within the comfort zone of 2%. But do you see any kind of change in stance or rates happening this year at least?
Question as a political analyst, I probably would say something with which Arnab would disagree. So I'm going to ask you if you kindly refer that question to his expertise rather than my lack of it. Arnab.
All right. So let me ask you then. Let me ask you then a political question, Mr. Newton. How do you really explain this change of stance in the United Kingdom when the rest of the Europe is going right? You have the UK voting for the left party, although the migration issue remains common to both the sides. But how do you really explain this? And what is the voter there thinking? Of course, cost of living crisis is a major crisis, but how are you really looking at this?
I think two things, and both of which we've mentioned collectively already. First of all, 14 years of Tories, it's time for a change. People get tired of a party. We see this in India a lot. You're very familiar with anti-incumbency in India, particularly in state elections. And secondly, the fact that, as I said earlier, Sir Keir has made Labour electable again. Just on the question of immigration, this is not a Labour Party obsession. Let's be clear about that. I think one of the things which Labour will do, which will help the British economy, which is short of qualified skilled labour and indeed a lot of unskilled labour in the farming sector in particular, I think Labour will take a much more relaxed view on immigration than the Conservatives have been doing. So I don't think we're necessarily going against the trend in Europe. I think we're just going the way in which the UK was bound to go.
Right. So, Mr. Newton, we'll have to see how that gets received by the electorate, by the voter, considering that immigration and migration and asylum asylum has really been a concern that's been resonating with not just voters in UK, but the rest of Europe as well. Let me come to you, Mr. Das, and thank you very much for patiently waiting. Your comments on the rate change trajectory that the central bank is going to take, like I was saying earlier to Mr. Newton, rates have been at a 16-year high, but do you see any kind of change happening at least this year or early next year? What is the sense that you're getting?
Look, I think the Bank of England would like to cut as soon as it can. As soon as the door is open through significantly better services inflation, right? Inflation hit target already last month, and so that would seem to open the door. But the problem is that the domestically generated forces for inflation, particularly services inflation, remains quite high, remains way too high for comfort. The market is expecting something like 2 cuts this year, starting somewhere between the August and the September meeting. To me, that seems fairly reasonable, but I wouldn't bet the farm on it. I would put I would have some expectation in my portfolio of somewhat lower rates in the UK. I think we are in a different kind of interest rate environment in general, more structurally, right? We're in a world in which trade barriers have gone up, investment barriers have gone up, the fiscal footprint of the state is larger in the UK. As we were discussing, the tax burden is high, and the question is how to fix the fiscal accounts at a time when countries need to be doing, feel they need to be doing industrial policies, subsidies, tariffs. And populations, particularly in Europe, are aging. In the UK, that is no different, especially if immigration is effectively addressed. I sort of agree with Alastair there. They won't want to do much. They won't be able to do much. We can talk about that more if you want. But the point is that there are going to be lots of fiscal pressures that are going to support inflation, probably in the years to come. So yes, I think we will get, one or two rate cuts this year. I don't think we're going down pretty sharply in rates after that. Although the market is pricing in a rate cutting cycle. I think we're in a structurally higher interest rate environment, a structurally higher yield environment in the UK and Europe, and especially in the US. And the UK is going to participate in a lot of these phenomena, right? Of trying to onshore, nearshore, and so forth.
Okay. Okay. Let me come to you, Mr. Newton. Most importantly, for all of us in India watching this election with bated breath, what does it really mean for India-UK ties here on, now that you have possibly a change of government happening, and of course there might be a change in stance as well in how the Labour Party really looks at relation at ties with India, given that Rishi Sunak is an Indian descent Prime Minister, and of course that really has been the binding factor. But how do you really see the ties change or evolve from this point on if the Labour Party comes back to power?
I don't think you'll see any significant change in British foreign policy whatsoever, apart from a more constructive dialogue with the European Union. That will be the key factor in Labour's foreign policy approach across the board. They will want to subtly, quietly, and non-controversially, not reopening Brexit, not going into the single market, etc., form stronger bonds with the UK's major trading partner. I think globally, otherwise, policy will continue much as before. A Labour-led government will keep Britain firmly in the Western alliance as far as the crisis in Ukraine is concerned. And I don't honestly, with all due respect, believe that having an ethnic Indian as Prime Minister of the UK has made any difference whatsoever, really substantively, to India-UK relations, which have been pretty good over the last few years across the board. And I think they will continue to be so, especially, and I want to underline this point, as the UK gets increasingly concerned about relations with China and looks at alternative markets for its exports and sources for its imports in Asia from which India stands to benefit. And I think that would be true whichever party was in government in the UK.
Right, Mr. Newton, let me get in the final word from you, Mr. Das. We have a quick 50 seconds, and if you could give your view on where do you see the trajectory of India-UK ties move on from here on. Of course, we are talking for an FTA talks, of course, as many other experts say, they are slated to continue. We also have exchanges as far as tech is concerned, as far as the mobility agreement is concerned. There is collaboration on other areas as well, including on climate, emerging technologies, maritime security. But how do you really see the India factor playing out in the United Kingdom? Because India has, of course, been able to increase its heft geopolitically. We have a great relationship going on as far as the United States is concerned, Russia is concerned, and of course with the rest of Europe as far as those countries are concerned. But if you could throw some light on specifically UK-India ties.
I think I would, once again, agree with Alastair. Look, I think the direction of travel is very clear. India is inexorably getting closer to the West, especially the United States, as you mentioned. And I think the improving relationships with Europe, with Japan, with the EU and the UK in particular are part of that bigger picture. The big challenge for India regionally and geopolitically, geoeconomically is clearly China. There have been tensions, there have been flare-ups at the border, there have been efforts to reduce foreign direct investment from China, and yet the trade surplus of China with India continues to grow. And that's true of many countries, not just India, right? So you have this kind of disconnect where the geopolitical tensions are high, the geoeconomic tensions are high, but the reality of the macro on the ground is that the integration continues. So I think there's not going to be any big rupture in Asia, but there is going to be a continuing integration or continuing alignment of India and other countries in Asia with the West, and including the UK.
All right. On that note, thank you very much, gentlemen, for joining us this evening and sharing your thoughts and perspectives on UK polls. It's indeed been great speaking with you this evening, but we'll have to...
If you like this video, then like, share and subscribe to ET Now.